So Cloudflare have recently announced dynamic workers, a lower level worker primitive that can be programmatically created by an existing worker. They're 100 times faster and more memory efficient than a traditional container since they run on V8 isolates. And because they're so cheap, you can spawn as many as you want for running AI-generated code, development previews, custom automations, and much more. I mean, they even said you can run 1 million dynamic workers per second if you wanted to. But does the fact that you can only run JavaScript on them limit their usage? Hit subscribe and let's find out. Last year, I made a video about Cloudflare sandboxes, which are basically short-lived Linux containers that run on a durable object. If that made no sense to you, then go ahead and check out the video. But they're perfect if you want a full OS container with a file system and the ability to run almost any language and any binary. But if you want something a bit faster, actually a lot faster, and much lighter, with the ability to run unlimited concurrent sandboxes in something that has the same limits as a regular worker, then you may want to reach for a dynamic worker. Let's go through how to set one up. So here is a basic worker I've just created with Wrangler, still with some TypeScript errors, maybe because I forgot to run Wrangler types. But in our Wrangler configuration file, I've added this worker loaders array with a binding is called loader. Now this can be called anything you want, but I've chosen loader because it's more conventional. And this binding allows us to create and control other workers. So in the updated code, we have a new worker constant, which uses the loader binding with these values. Now you can kind of imagine this as a Wrangler config file for the nested worker, but here the compatibility date tells the worker what runtime version it should be using, and here is the code that it's going to run. So as you can see, the code is very similar to a worker itself. It has a fetch function with a request env and context argument. And all it's doing here is responding with hello world from the sandbox. We've then prevented all network access, running the fetch function with the request arguments from the initial worker and returning the result. So if we run our worker locally and then curl localhost, we should see hello from the sandbox. But if we run that same curl request again, we'll get an error. And this is because right now we're loading a brand new worker. But what we can do instead is get an existing worker, which will give a name of worker1, and then run the code as an async function, meaning now if we run curl, we get hello from the sandbox, but if we run it again, it gets the information from the existing worker1 sandbox. Now, what I've just shown was of course a very simple example, but you can do some cool things with dynamic workers like define custom bindings like this chat room post method to create a stub, which the worker communicates with using cap and web, which yes, we've made a video about, so go and check it out if you're interested. You can use NPM dependencies like Hono and bundle them using the create worker function. And you can even intercept outbound requests to do things like inject credentials. But one of the big reasons for using dynamic workers is to run code generated by AI agents. So let's try and do that. Here is some code from the E2B cookbook that uses the Anthropic SDK to run Sonnet 3.5 with this system prompt and a custom tool to execute some Python in a Jupyter notebook. So the way this works is it will detect when the custom tool is used and then run that inside the E2B sandbox, which we can see the code for that over here. Now it runs it with this very specific prompt to calculate the value of pi using the Monte Carlo method on 1,000 iterations. And because it has access to the file system, it can create this image PNG and save it for it to be downloaded by the user or whatever the user wants. Unfortunately, dynamic workers don't have access to a file system, even though they can create a virtual one with this shell library, but because they run through a worker, we can provide details to it like an R2 bucket, which is Cloudflare's version of S3, that the image can be saved in. So if we look at the code, which is similar to the one from E2B, we can first see the system prompt that is being used and the custom Python execution tool that in this case doesn't use a Jupyter notebook, but does generate an SVG of the visuals. And here we have the code for the worker that, as well as running JavaScript, can also run Python. So we can see here it's using Sonnet 4.6. Here's the prompt that gets used. Here, the agent's code gets executed in the sandbox, and the response from the sandbox goes back to the main worker, which looks through it for the SVG code and then saves it in R2. So if we visit that URL, it takes a while, but it does generate the page with the relevant information from Claude. And if we scroll down, we can see this SVG that's being loaded from R2. It does look very different from the E2B one, but I trust that Claude Sonnet has produced the correct information. And of course, I did mention that it's also possible to programmatically spawn as many dynamic workers as you want, which you can do with code like this. That is a for loop that creates brand new workers based on the value from the API, and it also checks if a worker already exists and reuses it if it does. The code it runs is basically a console log and a response from the worker with the specific ID of the worker based on the index from the for loop. So with the code running, I could spawn 50 brand new dynamic workers, and we can see they all get created instantly. That was very fast. Now let's try it with 10,000. I'm not going to do it locally because I don't want to blow up my machine. So I've deployed my parent worker to Cloudflare so I can use their infrastructure. So here I'm going to spawn 10,000 different workers, and if I hit enter, they all get made insanely quickly. We can see there's a page of 30 of them over here, so I can keep going to view all the different worker IDs. And actually, the more I go, the more pages it shows. And I can communicate with a specific worker like worker 1156. Which responds with hello from worker 1156. So that's a quick overview of dynamic workers that are already being used by Cloudflare for code mode and Zeit for running LLM generated apps. But I should mention that while they're free now, they won't be free forever. So even though you can run 1 million dynamic workers per second, you may want to hold off unless you have deep pockets. And while we're on the topic of Cloudflare, if you want to learn more about their open source Vibe SDK that lets you build app generators like V0 and Lovable, then check out the next video.